Every town has a ghost story, but to truly understand the spirits that linger in Portchester, we have to look at the soil upon which they walked. I'm Victoria, and this is Haunted Places and Forgotten Lives. On our episode today, we're digging through time in Portchester, New York. We aren't chasing shadows with flashlights, we're tracing a timeline from the rugged colonial era of the 1700s through the blood-stained neutral ground of the Revolution and onto the neon-lit rock and roll energy of the 1970s. But we start at the beginning, before this was ever a port. The Wappinger people called this land Hasiko, the marshy land. They, along with the Wekuskek and the Siwanoi peoples, were a gentle alliance, eventually displaced by conflict and decimated by the diseases brought ashore by the early settlers. And unlike our traditional ghost tales, theirs is a spirit of place, a belief that the land itself is the ghost, that every footprint left behind by people over thousands of years is absorbed by the soil, the trees, and the rivers. Take the walking sachems of Teller's Point just to our north. Ancient chiefs seen walking the woods in errands of protest because settlers trampling over their graves have left them restless. In these local woods, local sachems like the prominent leader Shanarok once negotiated early deeds, attempting a fragile shared stewardship of the earth. Even the Byron River carries the weight of colonial friction created by the shifting borders. Local legend tells us that it was named after the indigenous people drawn again and again to the banks to buy rum from the early settlers. As the marshy land was cleared, the silence of the wilderness was replaced by the rhythmic sounds of the saw. By 1732, the name saw pit had first appeared in print. Long before mechanized mills started converting massive logs into planks, the settlers crossing the Byron River from Greenwich had established a brutal logging hamlet where this manual labor required grueling trench warfare. This era of Portchester appears silent in the paranormal records, but you have to ask, when the braces failed, crushing men and children, did their spirits remain trapped in the trench? Are those forgotten men and children now residual entities still down there sawing in the dark, too hard at work to know they've even passed on? When you walk the streets of modern Portchester, built directly over these old, soaked pits, take a moment to look down. Have you felt them and the weight of labor that has never ended? But the mud and sawdust of Sawpit would soon be washed away by blood. By 1777, this waterfront hamlet found itself trapped inside the neutral ground, an infamous lawless stretch of southern Westchester County. But it wasn't neutral at all. It was a violent no-man's land crawling with ruthless guerrilla raiders, loyalist outlaws, and marauders known as the Cowboys and the Skinners. Ambush was a constant threat. A sudden shadow in the trees usually meant death. The tension of that brutal era left a heavy residual energy in the soil, and at its heart sits a premier landmark of the Revolution. Located at 479 King Street, the Bush Lion Homestead stands as a silent sentinel to the past. Originally built circa 1720, its walls have held the historical secrets of this town for over 3 centuries. Between 1777 and 1778, American Revolutionary War hero General Israel Putnam, the legendary veteran of Bunker Hill in Boston and one of George Washington's most trusted commanders, made this house his tactical heart. Because General Putnam was a high-value target for British forces stationed just across the Byron River, this heavily fortified headquarters required round-the-clock armed guards. But the general isn't the only soldier permanently tied to this ground. Passed down through word of mouth, local lore whispers of a phantom sentry, a spectral continental soldier seen keeping watch near the historic front perimeter along King Street. Imagine the immense, suffocating stress of a real-life guard would have endured in this exact spot, standing in the freezing dark, eyes strained, scanning the tree line for a flash of British steel or a Skinner's blade. In ghost lore, that kind of intense vigilance is exactly what traps his spirit in an endless loop. Witnesses describe a fleeting, translucent man in a tricorn hat and military garb. He doesn't speak. He doesn't move. He simply exists as a classic residual haunting, a flicker in the periphery, endlessly performing his final duty. Interact with modern visitors. If you approach him, he vanishes. He is a spirit so dedicated to his post that he has spent over 200 years waiting for a command that will never come. The war ended long ago, but for the Sentinel of King Street, the watch is never over. Steps away on Wesley Avenue sits a structure that bore witness to a completely different kind of struggle. Today it operates as a partitioned apartment building, but beneath the modern drywall lies the skeleton of a massive 19th century private estate. Established in 1853 by Edward Barton Wesley, a titan of the era and the original co-founder of the New York Times, the 41-acre compound was meant to be a dynasty. In 1872, he erected a state-of-the-art 22-room mansion over massive brick and concrete foundations. But the Wesley family line was plagued by an unyielding and devastating heartbreak. Of their 6 children, 4 died shockingly young: Mary Elizabeth at 15, Ella at 20, Lillian at 17, and John at 22. The estate became a gilded tomb of parental grief. Later, a sorrow deepened when the Wesley's daughter, Ida Breck, lost her only child, Samuel. He was killed in action in France during World War I. Local legend whispers that the unbearable grief of a mother mourning her fallen son birthed the apparition of a woman in white, seen peering longingly out of the top floor windows. But the land wasn't done absorbing tragedy. During the devastating 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, the mansion was hastily pressed into service as a temporary isolation hospital. Doctors and nurses flooded the grand halls, treating waves of suffocating and dying patients. They saturated the building with carbolic acid and heavy chemical disinfectants in an attempt to keep the contagion at bay. Today, residents and visitors inside the apartments report a bizarre phenomenon: sudden and unexplainable waves of strange medicinal odors. In a paranormal research, this is known as an olfactory residual haunting. The sheer volume of chemicals used in these makeshift wards, combined with the raw terror of the dying, permanently imprinted this onto the building's material. The unexplainable footsteps and dragging noises heard alongside these smells mimic the frantic chaos of an emergency ward frozen in time. When the developers carved the mansion into modern apartments in 1925, they altered the layout but left the original foundations intact. And that is where the eras collide. Deep in the darkness of the basement, near the old coal furnaces and ice cellars, the atmosphere shifts. Caretakers and tenants report the faint sounds of children laughing, crying, and playing in the shadows. Are they the lost Wesley children, returning to the only home they knew, or are they small victims of the pandemic, permanently trapped in the foundations? At the Wesley house, the walls don't just hold tenants, they hold a legacy of death and quarantine. Of Wesley House are haunted by the silence of quarantine. The bustling transit lines of Portchester hold a spirit bound by a far more sudden, violent shock. Long before a single brick of the modern train station was laid, the iron rails of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad cut a dangerous path through town. And in the summer of 1919, they possibly claimed the first piece of a family's soul. It was 8:30 on a warm July night. A group of 15 local kids were playing a frantic game of hide and seek near the railroad bridge at the corner of William Street and East Broadway. Seeking the ultimate hiding spot, 9-year-old Philip Casone scaled a steel lattice pillar. He climbed high, 20 feet above the street, scaling the ironwork towards the summit. Warned to come down by an older boy, the little chap started his descent, only to strike a live wire carrying 10,000 volts of electricity. A horrific blast echoed through the neighborhood, and young Philip plunged headfirst to the cobblestones below. Witnesses rushed to the scene to find a pitiful sight. The boy's upper clothing burned entirely away, his body stiff, a tragic casualty of the early industrial expansion. He passed away at United Hospital just hours later. The name Casone has been christened in local tragedy, but the shadow over the name was only just beginning to stretch. Just 4 years later, in 1923, another Casone emerged in the archives: John Joseph, possibly young Philip's uncle, a successful Italian immigrant who founded the iconic bakery on South Regent Street. He would meet his own violent end. Before dawn on July 16, 1923, JJ stepped out of his home on West Street, carrying his keys and 2 boxes of yeast for his daily walk to fire up the ovens. From the pitch-black shadows of the backyard path, several assassins stepped forward, and 2 shotgun blasts shattered the morning silence. The assassins vanished into history, though they are reputed to be rival bakers from a nearby town, in a dispute with Cassone over a property lease. This brought on a second wave of grief and cemented the Cassone name into Portchester lore. Today, the bakery still stands and the trains still run, but paranormal whispers suggest neither Philip nor JJ ever truly left their final positions. Bakers arriving before 5 a.m. still hear phantom keys scraping the back doors and commuters walking past the iron bridges at night report a sudden static prickle in the air, the feeling of a fleeting shadowed figure watching from the high lattice steel. 2 lives cut short, bound by familial blood, and permanently fused into the machinery of Portchester. Just a short walk away stands a different kind of monument, St. Peter's Episcopal Church. With its weathered Westchester granite, sharp Gothic spires and glowing Tiffany glass, it looks like it was pulled straight from the pages of a Victorian ghost story. But its history in this town goes deeper than the stone you see today. Back in 1824, long before they had a sanctuary of their own, the early congregation met in the original sawpit schoolhouse. It was a humble beginning born directly from the rugged logging hamlet we explored earlier. But the history here isn't just in the stone, it's in the heat. In 1883, the original wooden church was swallowed by a catastrophic fire. We now know the culprit was a flying spark from the 12 o'clock southbound train, which ignited the roof and found a draft to usher it through the ceiling. Local residents, Mr. Robert Lambert and his wife, witnessed the smoke and watched, horrified as the wooden heart of the parish turned to ash, taking the lives of 2 brave firemen with it. For paranormal researchers, fire is known as a trauma marker. And when this stone sanctuary rose in 1890, it was built directly on the echo of that midday disaster. Parishioners have long reported a figure resembling a former rector silently blowing out any candles left aflame and moving ritual objects back to their proper places. Perhaps the terrifying memory of that fire keeps him locked here, eternally vigilant. But he isn't alone. In the back pews, a silent parishioner in Victorian dress sits perfectly still. She doesn't vanish, she simply isn't there when you blink. And then there is the clock tower. On nights when the village is completely silent, the bell has been known to strike a 13th time. Some say it's the rector's final signature, others believe it's a mischievous hobgoblin playing with the gears. Either way, at St. Peter's, time doesn't always move in a straight line. But as the village modernized, the ghosts moved from the pulpits to the classrooms. If you look up at the clock tower of Portchester High School, you're looking at more than a landmark. You're looking at the site of a legend that has haunted local teenagers for nearly 80 years. The story whispers of a student's tragic fall in the 1940s, a figure that still flickers past those high, narrow windows. It's often said that the fall wasn't a freak accident, but instead the result of a hazing incident gone awry. In my research, I looked for the records to ground this story in fact, but the archives are silent. There is no official report of such a tragedy, but does that mean the halls aren't haunted? Not necessarily. Sometimes a ghost is the way a community remembers its own collective anxiety. Maybe the tower ghost is just an echo of the thousands of students who have passed through the doors. But I want to hear from you, especially the Portchester locals. Did you see the lights? Did you hear the footsteps in the belfry? Tell me your story in the comments. I'd love to know what the local archives might have missed. But we can't talk about the spirits of Portchester without talking about its heartbeat. Located on Westchester Avenue, the Capitol Theatre has been the village's crown jewel since 1926. It has lived many lives, from a grand vaudeville house to the legendary psychedelic rock palace of the 1970s, and throughout every era, one resident has remained: George. Staff believe that George was a young man, a former employee or usher, who died at the theatre. He's known for being a bit of a trickster. Stagehands have reported him interfering with the equipment, particularly the lighting. There is a well-known story of a stage manager whose lights wouldn't turn on for a performance until he finally shouted, "George, knock it off!" and the lights immediately flickered to life. Security guards have even seen a figure sitting in the seats on their surveillance monitors, yet when they go to investigate, the seat is empty, even though the monitor still shows a lingering streak of movement. But the hauntings here aren't just about one man. Think of the millions of people who have stood in this room. the wall-shaking vibrations of the Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, and the Rolling Stones. That much raw human energy leaves an indelible mark. Sometimes when the house lights go down and the theatre is silent, you can still feel the thrum of a crowd that isn't there, the faint scent of phantom tobacco smoke drifting from the balcony. Staff and visitors alike also report a sudden, distinct smell of electrical fire drifting from the backstage wings. Many attribute this to the theatre's history of narrow escapes, including a significant blaze in the late 1940s that nearly claimed the auditorium. But even with the modern wiring and empty hallways, that acrid scent of burning wood and fabric still manifests out of nowhere. It's as if the walls themselves are stuck in a residual loop, forever playing that terrifying moment before the smoke cleared. The theatre's elevator is famous for having a mind of its own, frequently traveling to the basement or opening on different floors without ever being called. Locked doors shake violently as if someone is on the other side trying to claw their way in, only to find the hallway completely empty. Cold spots, the feeling of being watched from the high balconies. That intense emotional experience of the 1970s rock palace era has left a permanent electric imprint on these walls. I hope you've enjoyed our trip through the layers of Portchester, feeling the echoes of the past and walking with the lingering spirits, both intelligent and residual. If I've missed a local legend, let me know. I'd love to hear more about the history and the lives lived here in this bustling, vibrant community. I'm Victoria, and thanks for walking through Portchester's past with me.